Hello, everyone. I'm Douglas Fogle. I'm the curator of Thomas Damon, The Stutter of History, and I'm here with Thomas Damon. We're both in Los Angeles. Sadly, I'm not with you all in Shanghai, but we wanted to say a few things about the exhibition as it opens at UCCA Edge here in Shanghai. Thomas, the exhibition that we put together is very much a survey from the beginning of your work to the most contemporary work that you've made. You made new work for the space here. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to history as a topic and to your own personal memories related to the image making that you do, which is a very particular kind of image making that involves paper replication of images of the world already existing.
Over the years, I kind of tried to explore more about the connection between history and photography, which is very, very tight and has many facets, but it's, a lot of what we know about history of the 20th century is associated in our, how do you say, like long-term memory or short-term memory. It's associated with pictures. So now we kind of look very carefully who makes pictures and who sends them to us. But that wasn't always like that. There is a time when pictures would be the objective truth, because that was the only document of that event. I'm trying to explore that with my humble means of like basically creating whatever I photograph in front of the camera in life size, and kind of basically making the tight relation between the author, the instrument, and what's in front of the lens visible that way.
And when we should talk a little bit about your process, because you went to school at Goldsmiths and you were encouraged by one of your professors to explore making models out of paper, architectural type models. And before you photographed them, you were making sculptures. But your process for the audience here in Shanghai is multi-layered in terms of beginning from an image and then moving towards an image that you produce. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to that process and to the actual material you're using to make that image.
So it started really very simple. It was, I made sculptures and I wasn't sure they're good sculptures, and I didn't want to spend time, labor, and money on something which I wasn't really sure about. And cardboard, aluminum foil, plastic, whatever comes along seemed to be a very cheap and simple material. It has a lot of other advantages which I kind of found out about later, which I come to in a second. I made these just as sculptures in themselves, and I had the naive idea, so whenever I do a show I can remake them, and in the meantime I can throw them away, because I faced what every sculptor faces, like I have a problem of storage. And so I decided to throw them away, keep them in mind, or in a sketch maybe, and probably redo them when I ever have the need to make some. That was, of course, nonsense. And I kept making them until my professor at some point said, like, I think you should document them before you throw them away, because it's like in your mind, everything stays fresh, interesting, and good. But you know that when you read a text from like 20 years ago, it's actually a different text that you remember. By studying the relation between the original and the photograph, so many other problems kind of occurred, which, like, what happens if you photograph 2 objects or 3 objects? Of course, what happens is a narrative starts. And how can I control the narrative? How can I control the narrative, not only of the objects in the picture, but also of the viewer, who brings all the narrative he knew before to the picture and probably recognizes something there which I haven't been intending. And, it brought up all these beautiful problems to solve. And that's how it all started.
The process is now, and correct me, with most of the history works that you make, is starting from an image.
Yeah.
And you, from there, are doing what?
Mm-hmm.
A found image, I should say.
There are always rules in my work, like a simple rule, the playing field, playing rule. And one of them is like I never go to what the photograph shows me, because if you're superstitious, you would say if you go there and it's banal, then you lose a work. Whereas if you stay with your picture, everything you think the picture is, you're trying to get out of that picture by reconstructing it, is still intact. Like for instance, the grotto. I didn't want to go to the grotto and see it myself. I thought like all I need is this little postcard there, and I just can actually do it from the postcard. So what I do is like I take the picture, I study it very carefully. I get a little bit of background information because there might be another picture from the same incident from another angle, which would help. But usually I don't need that, and then I reconstruct everything in the same scale as I know the rest of my world. That means that many of my memories and my experiences of how the world looks like, how this table looks like, what shape this piece of paper has, all the ingredients of like our object world, are kind of somehow flowing into that thing. So everything I show you is basically gone through my own translation of my own memories, and I rebuild this in one-to-one. That's one of the reasons why I do it, and it becomes a piece of paper, a big object-filled, environment of papers. It's mostly interior spaces, and then I build it, I light it, I start photographing it, usually before I'm actually finished, because sometimes I just miss something which is important. But then once I photographed it and I am happy with the photograph, in most of the cases, or for the big works, it's still analog because simply the sharpness is so great. In a depth of field, I destroy the set. And that can go because it's kind of basically, I'm on the second floor. I don't need the ladder anymore.
What you're talking about in terms of reconstructing and the memory and how the viewer can project themselves into the work, each of these images typically has a backstory, which the question is, do we need to know them or not?
The material we share. The good thing about paper is that everybody who sees this has had a piece of paper in his hand today. Everybody knows when you kind of make notes and you don't like what you noted down, you just crumble the paper, you throw it into a bin. And it's such an old, temporary material, it has a lot of fragility which people are aware of. So if I build a chair out of paper and it's visible that it's kind of made out of paper, people know that this is not a real chair. It's very simple to make it very fragile and very light and very transparent in this way. I'm trying to really avoid artisanal stuff like papier-mâché or whatever. It's really like, if you look at it long enough, you could do it yourself. I really tried. That's another rule of those things. You just, anybody could do that. What I do, considering he has a lot of patience, and he gets a hold of the material, which is, you basically can buy it in every corner shop. So my works are very subjective in the sense of what they show. They cannot teach you about the world and its factual occurrences, or like how history really was. But it can give you a version to kind of have a distance between you and the daily occurrences. And I think art very often that's what the great quality of art can be, is to give you a certain distant viewpoint to what surrounds you and show you, what it also is, or how you could look at things as well. And if I do a show in China now, which I have to say, I have been in China, but I don't know enough at all to be able to say what the average Chinese viewer would kind of have in his mind when he comes to a museum. So I have to trust the local people which are helping me to kind of put the things together, and we have to. But on the other hand, I can speculate as a human being, and we all share the same media and the same like pictures being circulated around the globe. But of course, I trust the institution, and the institution can provide context if necessary.
If you think about the images you've made of the natural world, like clearing or pond, both of these have a real connection to a history of the ideas of nature that we have, or of art, or of an idyllic kind of situation. And I wonder, you've dealt with history, but you've also dealt with this natural world and our historical relationship to it. I wonder if you could speak a little about pond, grotto, clearing in terms of that kind of question of man's relationship.
Sure. In a positive way, you could say I'm looking for like a meta image or like ur-images. If you take off the anecdotal part where it happened, you look at a picture of destruction, or you look at a picture of order, or you look at a picture of repetition. And the repetition part is when nature comes into play. a tree has like 1 million leaves, a normal tree. I made a piece of grass, and you have like I put like blade by blade by blade by blade, but it teaches you modesty, and also like it's a kind of a meditation on that. These pictures, like the water lilies, like the clearing, like the grotto, they depict some idea of nature which has been completely embedded in our thinking of culture. Like the clearing is like a romantic, the light comes from the side, you have the forest, there are no beasts in the forest, there is no, there's no harm in the forest, it's just much more like a Eroica moment. Or like like Siegfried kind of comes on a white horse and rides through the picture or something like that. But I know that these pictures are kind of actually also in other cultures. Any culture which has a dense forest knows that the forest has some metaphorical quality, and it might be scaring, it might be, it might give home, it might be like going back to the roots or something. That is kind of, I think it's translatable. With the water lilies, of course, that is art, in terms of art history, even more. And of course, it correlates with your memory of Monet's water lilies. It's art history, and so what I look at is the cultivated version of nature. It's an image in itself already before I even started doing that.
I think that one of the interesting aspects of your work is the way you would look at the idea of artistic production in the studio. There's a number of instances in your work where you are focusing on an image that has to do with the studio, whether it's atelier, which you can talk about, or whether it's to a certain extent copy shop, which I look at as another kind of artistic studio. It's something that has been very important to you, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that. You're kind of highlighting the relationship, and in both of those cases, again, we're talking about paper. Paper as a metaphor or as a kind of symbolic and physical material object becomes a subject as much as the actual constructed material that you use.
Well, first of all, you could think of my work as like every picture you see on the wall is basically a window in my studio. So you always see what happens in my studio through my works, and this is a clear, straightforward documentation of that. But the studio as such is an interesting space for me because it's full of stuff which could become something, and others which will never become something.
And by the way, just to clarify, Atelier is based on an image of Matisse's studio when he was doing his cutouts.
The paper cutouts.
Paper on the floor.
Yeah, and it's kind of basically when he had a stroke and he was sitting in a wheelchair and he couldn't really paint anymore, and he found another way of, and many people say it's the best work he did, by cutting out pieces of painted paper. And so what you see is the leftovers on the floor. Now you could say we all stand on the shoulders of others as artists. I'm standing on the shoulders of Matisse in a sense, but like there are many shoulders in between. However, we deal with the leftovers. But all the pieces of the paper on the ground are the potential for another work. And that's what I really loved about this, because on one hand you could say, oh, this is like the leftover of me cutting out a fish. But if you look at it, it's also a fish, because if you put out the leftovers on the wall, then you have the silhouette of a fish, and it's still like everything can become something. That's the beauty of the studio in general. And in my case, I would say the copy shop is basically a very shortened version of what I do with reality. I try to copy it, and as we all know, if you copy something 100 times, the 100th copy is always a little bit different than the original. So I'm doing the same. I copy a thing which has been circulated by someone else through many, many other stages, and my thing is, different from the original. And it's all about paper, as you say again. So it's also like a complex relation to my own materiality.
I really like what you say about the 100th copy. Of course, it's going to be completely different from the first copy. And it's that gap where we came up with the title, The Stutter of History, that I thought about in terms of your work, both in the materiality that you're talking about, but also in the relationship between your final product and original images that, and I say original images, but images which are already replicating the world or replicating a historical scenario taken out of the news media. And then the gap between those, the model you build, the photograph you take and then the model gets destroyed and you put that in the world, or the gap between the copy of the world and the world itself and then your work. That kind of stutter when it comes to historical topics is what I think of as the mechanism that your work often uses in terms of addressing these questions of history and memory, because our own memories are also stuttered and not reliable all the time. We remember things differently.
But it's interesting what you say also, because like, of course, something else comes into that, exactly that equation, which is like, we don't have pictures in our mind. If I say Eiffel Tower, your brain kind of puts it all together and you know Eiffel Tower, but it's not in your brain, like it's always a construction and it will always look different. But the same thing is the notion of the fake, so a photograph is already a manipulative item. It is already showing you one viewpoint on something where 1,000 other things would have been probably behind the camera, next to the camera or something like that. That angle can go iconic, and it will be an iconic picture which represents what happened at the time, but it cannot represent what was not in front of the camera. And actually, even if people wrote that what you cannot see on the picture, but it is there, that information always gets lost. What stays is the picture, and so the picture kind of becomes the placeholder for like a reference or like a historical happening or an incident or whatever, and the picture has this power to stay in our memories. And so, but it is now becoming to fake news and everything. It's a very fragile little witness.
But then you started your sequence of dailies, your series, which are taken from your iPhone. Could you talk about the relationship between your taken images from your life that became your dailies and the history works? I mean, what are the dailies and how did you start working on those?
It came from looking at social media and the images which kind of getting circulated on social media, Instagram most of all. Because they hardly ever show something like an objective version of the world. That's not what they're for. It's a communication tool, and if you send a picture of something, it's something funny you saw, or mostly it's yourself somewhere. But it's kind of also like these funny little incidents you see on the street, but they're not more than a personal message. But in terms of quality, they are actually a genre in itself. I think they became probably the majority of images being circulated are actually not news images by professional news photographers anymore. It's actually social media images of somebody or something, which is kind of and it has to work as a narrative in itself. So all these pictures, they have more or less everything you need to know why this picture is remarkable or worth sending or not worth sending is on the picture itself. And that's what I was interested in. So instead of writing a novel for 6 years or making one of my pictures for 3 months or something, I thought maybe I just kind of need to go. Sometimes I have to go really quick, like a haiku or like a social media post or something, which is just there. When I went through my own archive of snapshots and things I had, I realized that sometimes you have these pictures of things which go wrong or things which kind of hang in a funny way or are beautiful but they're not meant to be like that or something like that, which I went through and I just kind of started rebuilding those. And the rule on that is that it should never take more than 5 days to make.
From the beginning to the end?
Yeah.
5 days. And you spoke earlier about the idea of the model and the model itself being the predicate of all of your work in a way. And then you began also shooting photographs of other people's models, the model studies. How did you come to that process where you were wanting to do that? And what were you looking for? What have you been looking for in photographing models of architects and now with Elia, the dress patterns of a fashion designer?
My models are always very clean, devoid of details, and they're trying to find the ideal representation of a room, even if the room is not an ideal room, but like they try to kind of give you a version of the room which has more to do with the memory of that room or a rendering of the room rather than what the room looks like. With photography, doing something abstract is very difficult because by definition, photography is indexical, is figurative, So I thought, what if I photograph other people's models to find out what they do with the models, and then also emphasize on the differences between my models and their models. So it wasn't about me finding the qualities of my work in other people. It was actually finding the opposite of my models in other people's work. And that's how I started. And then I looked at John Lautner's models, which are here in the Getty in Los Angeles, and they were very raw and very thrown together, and not looked after very well by himself, because he wasn't interested in the model, he was interested in a building. But the model was for him a communicative tool to find out the shape, change things accordingly to what he wanted to do, because he wasn't a draftsman, really. So, and then there would be a drawing later it would become a drawing. Sana works very much, a Japanese company, the architectural firm, like a wonderful firm. They work very much based on a model. And then the models they have, they're also never for the client, they're really for internal office communication. We have those some of those in the show. And the alaya is, of course, that you can think of a piece of cloth as these ingredients of geometric shapes, you know, and then you tie them together and it becomes a jacket. But first of all, they're actually geometric shapes. And he has done these geometric shapes for all his dresses himself. Those qualities, and what comes out of my looking at these models of other people, is basically you would not be able to recognize which building is in these photographs of Sana, or what is the jacket, which jacket did Alaya kind of have there, and which is hanging there. So it's not readable in that sense, like my other work is readable, but it's much more about the beauty of the object itself. And they become very abstract photographs for me. Like that's really what I'm after. And at the same time, they have the haptic quality of the material, which is mostly paper. They have the haptic material, like they have traces of use and meaning. Like, you know, here are the holes for like stitching it together. This could be a landscape, and then you see a little, you know, some scribble with a pencil for a tree or something like that. But so it's kind of always at the edge of not recognizable, but it's still something very recognizable as such. So the show kind of is like it's structured in 3 levels because of the space, and we try to make it an immersive kind of thing, much more than just the you know, like how many pictures on the wall. So it's really something which kind of builds up. And it builds up with wallpapers, it builds up with like an environment which is kind of getting denser and denser the more you walk in. We have on the second floor a very classic cut museums-like space with a little twist. We changed the speed with the dailies in the second floor as well. And on the 4th floor we have like, it's getting much more architectural. Then we have like 3-dimensional interventions, like a big cinema structure, like we have like a box within the box of the exhibition. We have the model studies in a section by itself, again with a wallpaper. So it shows it should have very different temperatures on the different floors, and it should be it's actually really composed as a way from the entrance to the end, and on that way we see many different chapters of the work. So that's what we tried, and I'm very happy about the outcome as far as I can tell, because unfortunately I couldn't come. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.